my name is Stephen Treglio with Bloom Shapiro, and this is our continuing Bloom Talk series on the new Revenue Recognition Guidance, ASU 2014-09, effective for non-public companies with periods beginning after December 15, 2018. Today, at a high level, we will be addressing the final step of the new standard, recognizing revenue when or as the entity satisfies a performance obligation. We will go over the key differences between point-in-time versus over-time, how to apply the different methods, and the disclosure requirements for each. So let's get started.
This slide is a little about me. It has all of my contact information, so please feel free to reach out with any questions that you may have. And then let's get started. The last step of the process addresses at what time revenue from contracts with customers should be recognized. One of the principal considerations used in this determination is whether the performance obligation is addressed at a point in time or over a period of time. This determination should be made for each performance obligation at the inception of the contract and is determined based on the method the entity transfers control of the promised goods or services to a customer. The guidance assumes a performance obligation is satisfied at a point in time unless any of the following criteria are met. First one, the customer simultaneously receives and consumes the benefits provided by the entity's performance as the entity performs. An example would be a cleaning service of an office building that takes several weeks to complete the entire building, but the customer is still getting a benefit every time one floor is cleaned. The second is the entity's performance creates or enhances an asset that the customer controls as the asset is created or enhanced. This second criteria relates primarily to work in process assets and if and when the rights to the asset are controlled by the customer through the process. In this case, the asset would have value to the customer at some point during the creation or enhancement process. An example might be software development, where the customer may have control of the related asset even though the development process is still not complete. And the last one, the entity's performance does not create an asset with an alternative use to the entity, and the entity has an enforceable right to payment for performance completed to date. This final criteria could be determined either by the product itself or the contract terms. For example, the contract term could specifically exclude the vendor from using the asset elsewhere, as in a trademark. Alternatively, the product itself could simply have no alternative use, such as a custom-built machine. So let's say you meet one of the criteria on the previous page and now must recognize revenue over a period of time. For performance obligations satisfied over a period of time, the new standard states that the revenue should be recognized by measuring the progress toward complete satisfaction of that performance obligation. The guidance actually describes two methods for measuring such progress, which are the input method and the output method. The input method measures the level of effort the entity must put into satisfying the performance obligation in relation to the total. Examples would be measuring progress by total labor hours expended, actual costs incurred to date, time elapsed, or machine hours used. These measurements would obviously be unique to the performance obligation, and it is also important to note that when using this method, any costs incurred that are not directly towards the satisfaction of the performance obligation should be excluded. Under the output method, the entity would measure completion of the total performance obligation either in relation to the total obligation which has been satisfied or in relation to what remains to be satisfied. Examples of output method would be something along the lines of milestones reached, units produced or delivered, and even appraisal of the results achieved thus far. It is important to note that you should use the method that most accurately reflects the progress towards satisfaction of the performance obligation. And once you've elected which method to use, the entity should apply that method in measuring the satisfaction of similar performance obligations in similar circumstances going forward. Now let's take a look at point-in-time revenue recognition. Under point-in-time revenue recognition, the main focus is determining at what point in time the obligation is satisfied. There are no distinct set of criteria within the guidance for when this occurs, but it does provide the following factors which should be considered. The entity has a present right to payment for the asset. The customer has legal title to the asset. Shipping terms are important to note here. The entity has transferred physical possession of the asset. And the customer has the significant risks and rewards of ownership of the asset. For this, I like to think that the customer may be benefiting from the asset as it already may be in use, or if any damage were to occur to the asset, the customer would be liable. And lastly, the customer has accepted the asset. These are all factors that need to be considered when deciding when control of the asset has passed to the customer and revenue can be recognized. The last item I'm going to touch upon are the disclosure requirements for Step 5. The first disclosure requirement, regardless of point or time versus overtime, is that the entity must disclose when it satisfies the performance obligation. That is, you must disclose which method you are using. For non-public companies, this is actually the only disclosure requirement that is necessary related to Step 5 in the standard. However, I am still going to go through the other disclosures that you could elect to disclose should you deem necessary and that public companies must abide by. For point-in-time recognition, a description of the assumptions used in determining how control of goods or services are transferred to the customer should be disclosed. And for over a period of time recognition, there are two requirements. The first is a description on the input or output method used, and the second is a description of why that method best represents the complete satisfaction of the performance obligations. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to reach me at my email on this slide, and be sure to check out other revenue recognition resources and articles on the Bloom website in the link below.